Bloodborne is one of the greatest PlayStation exclusives ever made, and more than a decade later, people are still asking for a remaster, a PC port, or a sequel. And yet, despite all that demand and the fact that it would rake in so much coin, Bloodborne remains locked to the PS4 and 5, running pretty much the same way it did back in 2015. So what happened? Why has one of Sony's most beloved games been left behind while so many other PlayStation franchises have already been revisited? Why don't we have a Bloodborne 2? Are we ever going to get one? The answer isn't that simple. But to fully understand why Yharnams remain frozen in time, we first have to understand how Bloodborne came to exist in the first place. The story of Bloodborne begins in 2012, shortly after From Software finished developing the Artorias of the Abyss expansion for Dark Souls. By that point, the studio had gone from a relatively niche developer to one of the most respected names in action RPGs, and Sony saw an opportunity here. Rather than asking FromSoft to simply continue the existing series, Sony approached the studio about creating an entirely new IP for its upcoming PS4. The goal wasn't to make Demon's Souls 2, nor was it to create another Dark Souls. Sony wanted a new flagship exclusive that could showcase the next generation of PlayStation hardware, while Hidetaka Miyazaki wanted the freedom to build a world that wouldn't be constrained by the expectations of the Souls series or the technical limitations of the older consoles. While Dark Souls 2 continued development under a different directing team, Miyazaki stepped back into a supervisory role so that he could devote his attention to this new project. Now, this was a significant gamble. Rather than immediately following up the game that had made FromSoft internationally famous, he chose to invest his energy into an unproven idea. At the same time, Sony's Japan studio, remember that name, joined the project as a co-development partner. That partnership brought together one of Japan's most ambitious first-party studios with one of its fastest rising indie developers laying the brick and mortar for what would eventually become one of the most defining games of the PS4 generation. But at this stage, there was no Yharnam, no Hunters, and no Bloodborne yet. There was only a shared goal between Sony and From Software, to create something that felt familiar enough to appeal to the Souls fan, but bold enough to stand on its own. And in order to accomplish this, Miyazaki knew he couldn't simply build another medieval fantasy. If this was going to become its own identity, then everything needed to evoke a different kind of fear. Instead of drawing primarily from medieval Europe, the team looked towards Gothic architecture, 19th century cities, religious iconography, and medical history to create this world that felt gorgeously oppressive and deeply unsettling. During development, members of the team even traveled to different parts of Eastern Europe, studying historic architecture in countries like Romania and the Czech Republic to capture the towering cathedrals, narrow streets, and the overwhelming sense of scale that would eventually define Yharnam. But rather than recreating any single location, Bloodborne became this patchwork of real-world influences transformed into something dreamlike and otherworldly. However, the city's visual identity was only part of that transformation. Its themes were built around humanity's obsession with knowledge, faith, and transcendence. Early in the game, Bloodborne presents itself as a gothic horror story. However, the deeper the hunter travels into Yharnam, almost without the player even realizing it, Bloodborne changes from its macabre horror into maddening cosmic horror. That gradual shift is one of Bloodborne's greatest and most defining achievements. But even though that transformation gave Bloodborne its identity, creating a new world wasn't enough. If Bloodborne was going to distinguish itself and stand apart from the Souls series, the way that the players interacted with the world needed to change as well. So Miyazaki starts thinking to himself about the philosophy of play. For an example, in the way that he designed Dark Souls, players usually play more cautiously and patiently, waiting for an opening. But by now, you know that in Bloodborne, you are imbued with the mentality of a hunter. You press forward into fights and you don't hesitate as you would in Dark Souls. In fact, you are in a sense admonished for playing passively yet rewarded for aggression. That philosophy that Miyazaki created shaped nearly every major system in the game. Traditional shields were almost entirely abandoned, replaced with firearms that weren't designed to deal heavy damage but to interrupt an enemy's attack at a precise moment to create an opening for devastating visceral attacks. Likewise, the regain system allowed players to recover recently lost health by immediately striking back after taking damage. Bloodborne was basically saying, if you were a pacifist, you need to start passing fists. Now, there are more things we could talk about that make Bloodborne unique, but for nearly 2 years, Bloodborne remained completely hidden from the public. This would change in May of 2014 when screenshots and gameplay footage from an unannounced PS4 title leaked online under the working name Project Beast. The footage garnered the attention of Souls fans who immediately said that it looked unmistakably like From Software's work, leading many to believe that they were looking at a spiritual successor to Demon's Souls. While the leak revealed very little about the game's story or mechanics, it accomplished one thing almost instantly: anticipation. Only a month later, Sony officially unveiled Bloodborne during the E3 2014 press conference, confirming months of speculation and introducing players to Yharnam for the first time. The game launched worldwide March 24, 2015 to widespread critical acclaim. Commercially, the game also found success. Sony officially announced that Bloodborne sold more than 1 million copies within just a few weeks of release, later confirming it had surpassed 2 million copies worldwide. FromSoft's work on Bloodborne concluded later that year with the release of The Old Hunters, an expansion that many fans consider to be one of the studio's finest pieces of DLC. Now, most successful games would have followed this momentum, but as you know, that's not what happened. But even years after launch, the community remained remarkably active, with every major PlayStation showcase or state of play reigniting the same old question: could this finally be the announcement of a remake or even a Bloodborne 2? Very few games can maintain that same kind of cultural relevance after more than a decade without a sequel or a major update. Bloodborne had become larger than the game itself, and no matter how much time had passed, it never left the conversation. So that brings us to the next question. If the demand had never disappeared, why hasn't Bloodborne returned? But the simplest answer as to why also happens to be the most misunderstood. Despite creating the game, From Software does not own Bloodborne. The IP belongs to Sony Interactive Entertainment. That means FromSoft can't independently develop a sequel, produce a remaster, release a PC port, or even announce a new Bloodborne project on its own. Every major decision about the franchise ultimately begins with Sony. However, ownership and authorship are not the same thing, and this is where Bloodborne's situation becomes unusually complicated. Legally, Sony controls the IP. Creatively, however, Bloodborne is inseparable from the people who made it. Miyazaki directed the game. FromSoft built its mechanics. Artists, writers, designers shaped its world, and Japan's studio, do you remember them, worked alongside them throughout development. So Sony owns Bloodborne, but FromSoft wrote the DNA. Miyazaki himself has consistently acknowledged this distinction in interviews. Whenever he is asked about Bloodborne, he gives the same response, that Bloodborne is not FromSoft's IP, so those decisions are ultimately Sony's to make. Also, he's never suggested that he's opposed to more people experiencing the game. In fact, in more recent interviews, he's even remarked that he would like to see Bloodborne reach a wider audience, but wanting something and having the authority to make it happen are different. And so now you can see the crux of the dilemma, the paradox at the heart of Bloodborne. The company that owns the game did not create it by itself, but the studio that did create it does not own the game. And as long as those two realities remain separate, bringing Bloodborne back is going to be far more complicated than simply deciding to make another game. But that complexity only grows after we realize that the original project's most important partners are gone. You see, when people think about Bloodborne, they think about Miyazaki and From Software, but Japan Studio played a central role in the creation and support of Bloodborne, serving as an essential production partner, helping to bridge Sony and From Software throughout the development cycle. However, in 2021, Sony reorganized Japan Studio, and many longtime staff members were consolidated to other divisions or they departed from the company. Now, none of this meant that Bloodborne suddenly became impossible to revisit, but it did mean that one of the key production structures responsible for creating Bloodborne no longer existed in the same form. So even if Sony woke up tomorrow and decided that it was going to make another Bloodborne, recreating the environment that produced the original wasn't going to be as easy as just giving the project to another studio. But that also begs the question, if Sony decided to do this, would they do it without the Miyazaki factor? Could they do it? Former PlayStation exec Shuhei Yoshida has publicly shared his own theory about Bloodborne's long absence. And to be clear, Yoshida presented this as his personal interpretation, not an official explanation from Sony. It is his belief that Miyazaki has a particularly deep personal attachment to Bloodborne, and that Sony, out of respect for him and for From Software, might be reluctant to hand the franchise over to another developer without his involvement. Now, whether this theory is correct or not is impossible to say from the outside, but it does help explain why Sony may have treated Bloodborne differently from many of its other legacy franchises. Nevertheless, one thing is undeniable. From Software today is a very different company than it was in 2012. Back when Bloodborne was in development, the studio was still establishing itself as a global force, but today, after all they have accomplished, especially after the enormous success of Elden Ring, FromSoft has the capability and the freedom to pursue original IPs on its own terms. This shift in the balance of power changes things because Sony's no longer working with an ambitious studio looking for its next breakthrough. It's working with a juggernaut in the industry. However, there's a little bit more to this. For years, fans assumed that if Bloodborne was ever going to get a remake, Bluepoint Games would be the studio that most likely was going to do it. Bluepoint had already established itself as one of the industry's premier remake developers, first with the Shadow of Colossus and then later with the PS5's remake of Demon's Souls. If any external studio had the technical expertise and experience to modernize Bloodborne, a lot of people thought it was going to be them. But according to later industry reporting, that possibility may have come closer to reality than anybody had realized. Following the reported cancellation of Bluepoint's live service God of War project, thank fuck that shit's not happening, Bloomberg reported that the studio pitched a full Bloodborne remake to Sony. Yeah, they went to Sony and said, hey, let's make a Bloodborne remake. And Sony took well to it, reportedly. They received it well internally. But the project ultimately did not move because From Software was said to be unwilling to have another studio remake the game without their involvement. For much of the PS5 generation, Bloodborne's silence has become increasingly difficult for fans to understand. Sony continues to invest heavily into some of its biggest franchises to the point that many people have Last of Us fatigue, and yet Bloodborne remained completely untouched. It became easy to assume the company had simply moved on. Until late 2024, when Sony and Kadokawa Corporation, the parent company of FromSoft, announced a strategic capital and business alliance. As part of their agreement, Sony acquired approximately 10% of Kadokawa's shares, becoming one of its largest shareholders. But the alliance did not mean that Sony bought From Software, nor did it mean Bloodborne suddenly had a clear path to a sequel or a remake. But around the same time, Sony also began placing greater emphasis on expanding its gaming properties beyond consoles through film, television, PC releases, and other media. Just this year in 2026, Sony made its most significant official Bloodborne announcement in years. An R-rated animated Bloodborne feature film was in development through PlayStation Productions alongside several production partners. After years of near silence surrounding the franchise, the announcement immediately reignited discussions about whether Sony was finally preparing to revisit Yharnam in a larger way. Now, I'm not one to read too much into things, that's not true. A movie doesn't exactly mean that we're gonna get a remaster or a Bloodborne 2. However, what I am thinking is that Sony is kind of testing the waters to see if there's going to be a new generation of people that like or have interest in Bloodborne. Perhaps, if they see the numbers doing well, you never know, Bloodborne 2. But the important part is that Sony still actively considers Bloodborne a valuable intellectual property. Guys, companies generally do not invest in expanding franchises, much less dormant ones, into new forms of media unless they believe those worlds have cultural and commercial relevancy and value. However, while Sony has been deciding on how they're going to use the Bloodborne IP, From Software has been busy building a future that no longer depends on it. From Software doesn't need Bloodborne anymore. And by looking at their most recent projects, we can see that they themselves know this. Along expanding the Elden Ring universe, FromSoft has continued to experiment with new concepts, including the Duskbloods. Now, while many fans have drawn comparisons between its gothic atmosphere, visceral blood imagery, and supernatural themes against those of Bloodborne, it is important to be clear that From Software has never described the game as a sequel, successor, or continuation of Bloodborne. But even so, it demonstrates that FromSoft has not lost interest in exploring the dark fantasy, gothic horror, blood-centered mythology that created Bloodborne. Today, From Software can explore these concepts through an IP that it fully owns and controls, with no influence in creative or business aspects from Sony. And that gives the studio a level of liberty that it simply didn't have stuff with Bloodborne. I'll be covering Duskbloods on my main channel when it comes out. I already have a Switch 2. My wife bought me a Switch 2. I love my wife. But I'm pretty sure that when we all start playing it, we're going to see the love letter-esque aspects of Bloodborne in the Duskbloods.